Okay, well, welcome back. And I think that version of Old Canada is going to become our official version here at Provis. Um, so good morning again. I have no major announcements for this October meeting. We're still zooming along, and we are planning on continuing to zoom along into the new year. The art gallery is not ready yet for us to reconvene in any effective way, but we'll keep you informed. We'll keep you up to date through our newsletter. So I'm pleased to welcome a guest, Keith Dobson, as a guest brought to us this morning by Jack Fernohoff. And welcome, Keith, and hope you enjoy today's program, and hope to see you back in the near future. I'd also like at this time to recognize the passing of two members. Jack Bentley died on September 14, and Jack was a member of our club for 18 years. And Bill Miles died October 3rd, and Bill was a supportive member of the club for 14 years. So if you please join me in a moment of silence to recognize the loss of Jack and Bill. Okay, thank you. So now we're going to move on with our program, and I'm going to hand the gavel over to Kevin. I see Kevin here somewhere to introduce our speaker, John Boyko.
Good morning, everyone. Thanks, Ken. It's my great pleasure to introduce our speaker today, John Boyko. A few highlights from John's bio, and an impressive bio it is. The first thing you need to know about John is that he plays a mean lead guitar. I understand, I may have it wrong, but he is a member of a rock band called the Footnotes. Isn't that right, John? Have I got that right?
That is correct.
Now, I find Footnotes is a very apt name for a band with a writer in it. Fantastic. And somebody told me you sing as well. Are you going? Is that true?
I'm also the lead singer in the band. Yeah, the drummer came up with a name which was a joke on me being an author. They wanted to call it Johnny and the Footnotes, and I said, no, the Footnotes will do.
Oh my God, great. Gary, are you listening here? Gary is our student guitar player, and yeah. I'm sure you guys could get together and give each other lessons. Here we go.
Our band actually learned a song last week from the 21st century. We thought, wow. My God, we're stepping forward.
Okay, all right. So the rest of the bio, John is a local boy. We found that out just when we chatted to him a few days ago. He was born in Hamilton and raised in Burlington, and has multiple degrees. He's very well educated. He has degrees from Trent, from Mac, and from Queens. Most of his career, he's been a teacher at Lakefield College School. That's near Peterborough. I think a history teacher, right, John? You did mainly history? Right. And he's then moved over to being the director of their summer school program. And he's been doing that for a long time. Over 20 years, is that right? I think I got that right.
I've been at the school for about 25 years, yes.
25 years, yeah. And in between times, he's held public office. He is a municipal councillor and a deputy mayor in Lakefield. And also, which is interesting, because when I invited John, I had his name, I looked him up, and I saw that he was an author, but I didn't realize he was an op-ed writer. He's a prolific op-ed writer, and that was about a month ago. I was reading the Globe and Mail on the weekend, and in there, lo and behold, was one of his pieces. And it was great. It was about the importance of federal elections. And he homed in on 3 particular federal elections that helped shape Canada's future. And it was a full page spread. It was fantastic. And, you know, I was very impressed. And of course, as we know, John is an author, a writer of some repute. Over the past, I think it's 10 years you've been writing the books, right, John? Give or take?
A little bit more than that, but yeah.
A bit more than that. He's written 8 books, all of them, I think, on political or historical topics. And this morning, John's talk will relate to some history close to home, and that's specifically Canada's involvement in the Vietnam War. And I'm not going to steal his thunder, but I'll mention a couple of things. Some of the events of the war will be familiar to us. I think we all know about them. The US draft dodgers and deserters, quite a lot of deserters who came north to Canada. And some facts not so well known, in fact, secrets. And I learned about this when I was reading up on it, and quite surprised and shocked. One fact is that Canada was supplying the US with weapons for their war effort in Vietnam, including napalm and Agent Orange. I couldn't believe it, but John will get into that in a bit more detail. Anyway, all of this and more John details in his new book, which we all should read. I'm doing a plug there for you, John. And it's called The Devil's Trick: How Canada Fought the Vietnam War. So over to you, John.
Thank you very much. And thank you very much for the invitation to be with you this morning. I wish we could be together in person. I have spoken 3 times at the library in Burlington. And while this is nice, I bet we could get unanimous consent that we all wish we could be in person back at the library again. I did grow up in Burlington. My grandparents lived about a 10-minute walk from the library down toward the lakeshore in Burlington. And I grew up in the East End in a house that backed onto New Street between Hampton Heath and the Burl Oak Road. So I grew up out there until my father moved us to Peterborough, and I've been here ever since. So it's great to be home, kind of, although I'm sitting in my house. It's great to be home in Burlington. Yeah, it was mentioned, Kevin mentioned that there are a number of surprising things about the Vietnam War, and that's what I'm going to be talking about today, my current book, my 8th book. How I came to this is I was researching this book. It's called Cold Fire, Kennedy's Northern Front, and it was all about how President Kennedy had affected Canada. And so I was in the Boston Kennedy Center in his archives reading the papers, and out in Saskatoon reading Diefenbaker's papers when he was dealing with President Kennedy. And what I found surprised me, and that is that every time there was communication, almost every time there was communications between the president and either Diefenbaker or Pearson, they talked about Vietnam War. And I thought, why are they talking about the Vietnam War when, one, the Vietnam War hadn't even started yet, as we know it, and the other thing is Canada wasn't involved. I knew about the draft dodgers. I knew about the a number of people who came. We called them boat people that came after the war. But why are they talking so much about Vietnam? So I started digging into it more and more, and the things that surprised me are in now my current book, and I'm showing it up because I hope that everybody after this talk will go out and buy 2 or 3 copies because Christmas is coming up. So what we have then is what I'm going to talk about today are not the entire book. I couldn't do that. And the book is not about the Vietnam War. So if you want to find out about the battles and all that kind of stuff, there's lots of books for that. What I want to talk about, in order to summarize the book a little bit, is what surprised me in my research. And what I did when I began my research is I tried to say, okay, at the beginning, I'm going to have to talk about how the war started. So the war started when the Americans really sent their troops in 1965. Well, that's not true, because Kennedy sent advisors in 1961. Well, okay, yeah, but the French were there before, and there was the okay. Well, then there was the and by the time I went all the way back, do you know when the Vietnam War started? 111 BC. 111 BC. That's when China began invading what was called the Viet territory at that point. And the Viet people said, we want 3 things. We want a country that is united, that is ruled by us, and the foreigners out. They wanted those 3 goals in 111 BC, and they started chasing out the Chinese. And they eventually did. And then the Japanese came in, they chased them out. And then the French arrived in the 1600s seeking gold and selling God. And they were there for a whole long time until 1940, when Hitler invaded and took over France and kind of distracted them a little bit. Then the Japanese came in, then the Japanese left when the Americans dropped bombs on them. The French came back. And until 1954, the French were there with the Vietnamese fighting for the same 3 goals. 1954, finally, Ho Chi Minh, who was the communist leader of basically focused in the north, but basically the leader of all of Vietnam, and his guerrilla troops defeated the French. Out they went. How's that? I just did history from 111 BC to 1954 in under 60 seconds. I'm kind of proud of myself. So what we did then is in 1954, the major powers, Britain, the United States, and France, and Russia, and China, met in Geneva, where all good international meetings happen. And they decided, okay, here's what we're going to do with Vietnam. We're going to split it temporarily in the middle at the 17th parallel. The French get out, and the North, anybody who wants to move south, go ahead. Anybody who wants to move north, go ahead. Just for now, Ho Chi Minh, you run, the communists run the north. And just for now, the south will be run by this guy named Diem until 1956, when we have an election. And then all the foreigners will be out. The country will be united, and it'll be ruled by whoever the Vietnamese people want to get ruled by. Okay, that was all cool. But then how are we going to police this? Who's going to take control and make sure that everybody's playing by the rules that we just established? So the communists said, well, we'll send in Poland to represent communist interests. We'll send India in, and they will represent all of the interests of the non-aligned nations, non-aligned in the Cold War that's going on. Who will represent the Western world? And they said, Canada. Canada will represent the West in what was called the International Control Commission. So in they went. The prime minister at the time was a guy named Louis Saint Laurent. Do you know when he learned about this? When he opened up his Globe and Mail in the morning and it was reported in the news. Nobody asked Canada. Nobody contacted the diplomats, contacted the prime minister. They just said, Canada, you're it. So now they went to the guy who was the external affairs minister at the time, Lester Pearson, who we'll hear about more. Lester. Sorry, I shouldn't tease him. Lester Pearson, there he is. He had spoke with a little bit of a lisp, which is a terrible thing if your name is Lester Pearson. But anyways, Lester Pearson was asked, who should we send over to run this International Control Commission in Vietnam? He had met a guy when he was a student at Oxford, and he said, we should send over this guy who was a brigadier general, and he is an incredibly accomplished lawyer out in Vancouver. He had been wounded in the First World War, wounded in the Second World War when he was at Dieppe and just after D-Day. So he knows war, he knows the law, he would be perfect. His name is Sherwood Lett. We'll send him over. So now we're to the point where I can say what I did to structure this book is I picked 6 people. And these 6 people were going to represent the 6 major points of interest to me, and I hope to readers, of how Canada was intricately involved in the war. And he is one of the 6. So I'll briefly go through the 6, and that'll be my talk this morning. So what happened was Sherwood Lett arrived, Brigadier General Lett arrived, and he was going to take control of the Canadian portion of this International Control Commission, landed in Hanoi and in North Vietnam. And he was put into this great big white car, driven through the streets of Hanoi on his way to the Metropole Hotel. There were 3 deep people cheering and singing songs and waving red flags. And he all the way from the airport to the hotel. And he thought, this is magnificent. There was bunting on the buildings as he got downtown. And he said, this is great. He was smiling and waving. And he arrived downtown at the Metropole Hotel, walked in, and the clerk in the hotel said, well, I'm really sorry to tell you, sir, but all of those people are there because we're expecting the Russian ambassador today, and they thought that was you. He learned a really important lesson about Vietnam, and that is nothing is as it seems. The Canadians were there and oversaw the French leaving, made sure that that happened. The Canadians, with about 350 soldiers and diplomats moving all around the country, oversaw the southern people, mostly Catholics who had to run from the persecution and get south, and all the people who wanted to go north. And he saw it all. But what he also saw and tried to do something about but couldn't was that the Viet Cong, these are the guerrilla fighters working with Ho Chi Minh, were digging great big holes in the ground and tunnels and burying weapons and then mixing in with the local community and not really leaving. He reported this to Pearson and Saint Laurent, who reported it to the Americans. And then came time for the election to happen, the election that the Geneva Convention said was going to happen. And he reported back, you know what? When this election happens, the communist Ho Chi Minh is going to win, hands down. Everybody in the North wants him to win because of the three goals that I keep repeating. Almost everybody in the South wants him to win because of those three goals. And because the leader of the South, a guy named Ziem, was corrupt. He was awful. He was just helping his family and he was getting rich. He could have been a prototype for Donald Trump, but I won't get into politics. All he was there for was the power and the wealth and the prestige and the ego, and nobody wanted him. And Lett said, we have to let this election happen. I know the North and the communists will win, but if we don't let it happen, there is going to be a war. There is going to be a war that will last for a long, long time. All these weapons will be dug up. And what will happen is we, that is the West, will lose because the Vietnamese want the foreigners out, one united country and one leader, and that leader should be Ho Chi Minh. We then had the deeply ironic situation where the communist world, the Russians, the Chinese, the North Vietnamese, wanted this democratic election to happen. And the democratic world, that is Britain, Canada, and the United States, did not want it to happen. And it didn't. Lett went home after a year. His time was up. The ICC in Canada remained there, but he took no satisfaction in knowing that he had been right. The war that he predicted, because of what he said, it happened. Let's skip ahead now. Let's skip ahead to 1965. In 1965, President Johnson now knew that the reason for the Americans being in Vietnam, just advisors, not great gobs of troops, was bogus. Eisenhower had sent the first military advisors in. The first American to die in Vietnam was in 1945. They've been there since then. And then Kennedy, and then Johnson. They were there because of what was called the domino theory. That is, if we allowed Vietnam to turn into communists, then Laos, Cambodia, Philippines, all the other countries would fall to communism. He had the CIA, Johnson had the CIA do a report. They came back with the report and they said, no, it won't happen. If Vietnam became communist, none of the countries around it would become communist. There's just not that desire in all of these other countries. So the whole reason for the Americans being there was junk. And Johnson knew it in 1965. So he said, I got to get the Americans out of there. But because we're in the middle of a Cold War, I can't just allow the communists to take over the country. So he said, I need to negotiate with the North. I need to negotiate with Ho Chi Minh. The problem is the Americans had no ambassador in North Vietnam. Not only did they have no ambassador, they had no back channel communication. So we need some way to meet. So he called Lester Pearson, who is now the Prime Minister of Canada. This is 1965. And they met surreptitiously, secretly, in a hotel in New York. And Johnson said, here is the message that the CIA and the State Department and I have presented, would like to present to the North Vietnamese, a way out of this war. But we would like the Canadians to act as an intermediary. Pearson agreed. They then left the hotel and they told the reporters that were gathered downstairs that this was just a coincidence. Pearson was there for a meeting and Johnson was there for a play, and this is just a coincidence. We didn't talk about anything of consequence. It's good that politicians don't lie to us now. The politicians are honest and wouldn't do anything like that now. But in those days, Pearson went back to Ottawa and he said, I know the guy. And the guy's name was Blair Seaborn, very experienced guy. He then became the head of the new International Control Commission, or the new head of the International Control. Over he went. I was honored in researching this book to meet him. The guy was 96 years old. He was amazing. And he told me stories that in all of my research, I didn't find and never would have found. He talked to me about being in Hanoi, meeting with the Prime Minister of North Vietnam, and telling him in French. The two of them spoke in French in this great big, what used to be a French palace. And he told the South Vietnamese or the North Vietnamese Prime Minister that the Americans will leave, and all we want is for the North Vietnamese to leave the South Vietnamese alone. Pull all the Viet Cong out, no more guerrilla actions, try to undermine, and just let the South Vietnamese government be. And then you guys can carry on just like North and South Korea, Communist North and Democratic South. And if you do that, the Canadians said, we'll give you all kinds of economic help in order to make your way through the next transitional period, and the Canadian government will give even more. Now, he went around after that meeting. Blair Seaborn went around and he talked to a whole bunch of other people, generals and other government officials, and just people on the street in and around Hanoi. And then he wrote a long cable back to Prime Minister Pearson, who shared it then with President Johnson. And he said, this is the best deal we can ever get. We accepted it in North Korea, accept it here. But what they want is eventually, not immediately when the Americans leave, but eventually within a few years, let all of Vietnam be ruled by one leader in a united country with the foreigners out. And the new Vietnam will remain non-aligned in the Cold War. We will not export our communism elsewhere, which the CIA said they couldn't do anyway. And we will just live happily ever after, and there will be no war. If, however, you don't accept this, the North Vietnamese Prime Minister told the Canadian, then there will be a war. And you can invade us, you can bomb our cities, you can do whatever you want for as long as you want, you will never win. And Blair Seaborn said, after talking to the North Vietnamese people and North Vietnamese business people and North Vietnamese housewives and North Vietnamese generals, this is true, he said. So Johnson was given a way out of the Vietnam War, just like President Eisenhower had been given a way out of the Vietnam War by the other Canadian. And what did Johnson do with that? Nothing. Ignored it. So what we had, if we jump again to 1973, when President Nixon finally signed the deal in January 1973, where the Americans left, do you know what deal he signed? Almost the exact same deal that Blair Seaborn had in 1965. 58, almost 59,000 Americans died. Almost 3 million Vietnamese people died for nothing. If only the Americans had listened to the first Canadian, and if only the Americans listened to the second Canadian. We gave the Americans 2 ways, 2 times to avoid war, and we were ignored. Another person that I found who was fascinating was a woman named Claire Seaborn. Claire Seaborn was 48 years old, and she was an administrator in a hospital in Montreal, and she read her Saturday newspaper. Remember the Saturday newspaper? A lot of people here have the same hair color as me. You will remember when the Saturday newspaper was about that thick, and in the middle of the Saturday newspaper, there was a weekend magazine. Do you remember that? I'm seeing some nods. Yeah. And what we had was, I love that because I used to cut the hockey player out of the, and then have put it up on wall, like Andy Bathgate or Stan Mikita, people like that. And she read that magazine, and in there was an article about a Canadian-made, Canadian-staffed hospital in South Vietnam. Canadians had 5 hospitals in South Vietnam. The Canadian government built them. The Canadian government staffed them with Canadian doctors and nurses. And she said, this is a good thing. I can do something that is helpful to a humanitarian effort. She applied and was accepted. And within 6 months, she was in Vietnam at this hospital, focusing on tuberculosis. There was an outbreak of tuberculosis at the time. And she was supposed to be there for a year. She lasted about 6 months. And she didn't leave because of the horrors of the war, which were all around her and palpable. She didn't leave because of the horror. She left because of the hypocrisy. You see, she kept meticulous records of all of the people that were coming through the hospital. And they didn't just deal with TB cases. They dealt with people who were being napalmed, falling victim to Agent Orange, falling victim to the bombing, to the raids. And there were children, and there were women, and there was all kinds of people that had nothing to do with the war that were being injured and horribly disfigured, and things that she just could not possibly imagine encountering when in Canada. But she didn't leave because of that. She left when she discovered that the director of the hospital was taking her meticulous records and giving them to the local CIA, the American CIA, who were using them for a program called Phoenix. Phoenix was a program whereby they went into various villages using the records that the Canadians were giving them and trying to identify who were the Viet Cong or the Viet Cong sympathizers. And they would take the men based on these Canadian records. They would torture them for more information. They would kidnap them and take them away, never to be seen again, or they would simply shoot them. And the Zippo raids that you heard about in these villages. Zippo raids, where when you would take your Zippo lighter and just light the village on fire. The saying was, kill them all, let God sort them out. What villages did they decide to go get? The ones that the Canadian hospital records said, there's people coming from this village and it looks like there's suspicion here. So Canada was intricately involved in this war. Now, the other thing that she learned, and Kevin mentioned this, is that when she went back to Ottawa, she wrote a long report for a guy named Maurice Strong. You probably have heard that name before. He was in external affairs at the time. And she said, how dare the Canadian government be building these hospitals to help people when we were also selling weapons to the United States that are being used on people that are filling up these hospitals? There is nothing more that shows what hypocrisy is all about than that. She discovered, yes, the napalm that was being dropped. Napalm is the gaseous substance that you drop on forests to try to defoliate the trees so you can see the Viet Cong from helicopters. But when it lands on a person, it essentially burns the skin off them. I bet you've all seen the photograph of the little girl running naked down the street after an American raid of napalm on her. That little girl, by the way, is still alive, and she lives just north of Toronto. That was Canadian napalm. Agent Orange, the stuff that is the gaseous stuff that is dropped to, this is the stuff that was being made in Alliston, Ontario, just a little north of Burlington, about a 45-minute drive. Also, we were selling TNT. We were selling missile guidance systems. We were selling bullets. We were selling boots. We were selling shoelaces. We were selling the iconic Green Beret caps that were made in Winnipeg. We were selling weaponry of about equivalent in today's dollar, $2.5 billion a year. She went across the country doing speeches in church basements and universities. She made a film. She wrote letters. She wrote articles in newspapers. And she even held a 10-day fast on Parliament Hill that brought international attention to the fact that Canada was supplying all of this weaponry to the United States for the Vietnam War at the same time as we were saying we were neutral in the war and not involved. A lie, a gigantic lie, a Trumpian lie. So what we had then was, in this fast, a whole bunch of members of parliament came out, including a guy named Jean Marchand. Do you remember that name from the 1960s? Jean Marchand from Trudeau cabinet minister. He came out and was talking with Claire Seaborn right around the Eternal Flame. This is late 1968. And he said, do you want to be the one to tell 130 Canadians that they are out of work because we no longer want to sell weapons to the United States? In that question, there's the crux. We were making money. We were creating jobs. The Canadian government, I've read when the Canadian government was in cabinet meetings saying in the same meeting, there is no way the Americans can win this war. It's unwinnable. It cannot be won. And at the same meeting saying, oh, by the way, armored vehicles that are being made in London, Ontario are going to be sold to the Pentagon for use in Vietnam, approved. Is that moral? Is that ethical? Those questions were being asked. Those questions are still being asked, by the way. There's a war being fought in Yemen. Saudi Arabia is fighting this war. It's been told by over and over motions in the United Nations that it's a war that should not be happening. It's immoral, unethical war. The Canadian government has said this war should not be happening. It's an unethical, immoral war. At the same time, we are selling weapons to the Saudis for use in that war. So I guess we didn't learn our lesson in Vietnam. We are still willing to sell principles for profit. Another person that I met a long time ago up here, let's talk about the draft dodgers just for a second. I knew Joe Erickson for years, and he was asking me one day, well, what's your next book about? And I said, well, I'm writing a book about Vietnam and Canada's involvement in Vietnam. And he said, oh, really? I'm a draft dodger. I've known the guy for 15 years, never realized that. There were 30,000 draft dodgers that came up. And so Joe Erickson is the one that I talk about. He came up from Missouri and was in Winnipeg, eventually Toronto, and then in my area, the Peterborough area. I knew about the draft dodgers. I think we all know about the draft dodgers. What I didn't know, in my research, I discovered that poll after poll after poll from 1965 to the end of the war, the majority of Canadians did not want them here. The majority of Canadians. There were organizations, there was one in Burlington, there was one in Peterborough, there's one in Toronto, major cities all across Canada that helped the draft dodgers to arrive. Churches gave the money and the logistical support for these organizations to be there to help the draft dodgers to arrive. It was the Christian thing to do. But the majority of people in polls taken among churchgoers said, we don't want them here. So the money that they were putting in the collection plate was helping the draft dodgers to arrive. And the church leadership wanted to help, but the laity, the people in the pews, did not. I put in the book, The Devil's Trick, some of the quotes from the mayor of Toronto, from the mayor of Vancouver, and other mayors that did not want them here. And they talked about the same thing that many people saw. Here's a whole bunch of young people, long-haired young people listening to that rock and roll music. It's going to destroy the world. It's going to warp your spine. And they're Americans. And there was a growing anti-Americanism at the time. We don't want those long-haired kids corrupting our kids and these Americans in here taking our jobs. And anytime you hear immigrants are coming, taking our jobs, it's junk then, it's junk now. But that was one of the reasons they didn't want the American draft dodgers coming in. Joe told me an interesting story about, and it was 2001. Remember, he came here in 1968, became a Canadian citizen in the early 70s, been here for his almost entire adult life. He was stopped on the border going home for a high school reunion, questioned, interrogated for over a half an hour. And they finally let him in. in 2001 when he got down and he found out from his family what had happened to them as a result of his leaving. It curled my hair. And it happened to draft dodgers throughout the United States. The FBI zeroed in on their family. And what the FBI did to families for years shocked me. Another person I got to meet was a guy named Doug Carey. Doug Carey was an amazing man. He lives just outside of Ottawa in a place named Carleton Place. And Doug Carey was 18 years old and living in Oakville, just down the road from you. And he was 18 and he decided, what I want to do is join the army and I want to fight in Vietnam. And he became one of about 20,000 Canadians that signed up with the American military and fought in Vietnam. This surprised me. I knew there was some, but I didn't know there was 20,000 of them. I spent a great deal of time with Doug Carey and spoke with many others who did the same thing. And I discovered there was 3 reasons why they wanted to do that. First, they said, and this was Doug Carey's primary reason, he had grown up in the early 60s, late 50s, early 60s, and every man that he knew was a veteran. His father, his uncles, his neighbors, the barber, the mechanic, teachers, they had all fought in the Second World War or Korea. It was rare that a male was not a veteran. So he decided that it was part of his duty, part of his ticket to adulthood to sign up. He could sign up for the Canadian Army, but there was no war being fought by the Canadian Army. So he went to Buffalo and he signed up. And in no time, he was a Marine and he served for 2 years, for 2 tours of duty in Vietnam and experienced many of the things in Vietnam that all of the other soldiers that we know from the movies and books, from the Ken Burns series, we know what war was like for those young men over there. The average age was 19. Picture that. The average age. That means that the half of the American soldiers were like Doug Carey, who was 18 when he was there. A second reason that many Canadians left and fought in the war was because they had been told by the Canadian government, by the American government, by movies, by TV, by everyone, that communism is evil and we've got to fight it now and we've got to fight it over there so we don't have to fight it here. Well, there was only one place in the world where communism was being directly confronted. So people signed up, Canadians, kids signed up to go fight the commies. And the third reason is common to all wars, and that is these were young men who thought, if I go fight and be brave, I'll come back and get the girls. So there was the third reason. Doug Carey said, yeah, I was kind of interested in that too. So over they went, 20,000 of them, about 160 of them are on the Vietnam Wall. And if you've ever been to Washington, D.C. and gone to the Vietnam Wall, that Veterans Memorial is a moving experience, a spiritual experience. You will almost always see Canadian flags along the wall. They are commemorating the 160 Canadians who lost their lives. 160 Canadians who lost their lives, but 20,000 came home. And when they came home, they suffered in a couple of ways. One, they were ignored. The Royal Canadian Legion would not allow them to join because they weren't Canadian soldiers. They weren't allowed because the Legion controls Remembrance Day ceremonies, even to lay a wreath at memorials on Remembrance Day. They weren't allowed to join the Legion and go in to have a beer. They weren't given the satisfaction of having a monument built, despite the fact that they worked on it for years. They were given no compensation from the Canadian government or from the Legion or anyone else, despite the fact that at a per capita basis, more Canadian soldiers came back from Vietnam suffering from post-traumatic stress disorder than American soldiers, mostly because they had zero support when they arrived home. Doug Carey's in his 70s now, and he told me he's an avid golfer. He likes to get out almost every day. He said he cannot walk down certain fairways at his golf club without looking into the woods on both sides, because they are narrow and there's woods on both sides. And he said, I can't help it. Every time my eyes dart back and forth looking for danger in the woods. He said it was about 9 years ago now. He said he was walking in downtown Ottawa when one of those great big buses backfired. He was 71 years old at the time, and he leapt over a hedge into a yard. The stress is still there. There has been suicides, lost jobs, lost marriages, lost friendships. And the young Canadians who fought in Vietnam are still fighting the Vietnam War in their heads and in their hearts. The last person I want to talk about is a woman named Rebecca Trin. Rebecca Trin's fascinating. She lives in Calgary. And she was living in Saigon throughout the war with her husband, Sam, and her two daughters, Judy and Helen. And these are all Canadian anglicized names, of course. But they were living there. And 1973, when the Americans left with that deal that I talked about, it was 2 years later in 1975 that the North Vietnamese moved and took over all of South Vietnam. And we remember when that happened. And we remember the last helicopter leaving the roof of the American embassy. That was the shudders that a lot of people have with the escape from Afghanistan in its final days. And what happened? The North had now got the Americans out, so the foreigners were gone. They had united the country into one, and it was ruled by one leader in the Communist North. So they had basically achieved the goals of Ho Chi Minh in 1954 and the Vietnamese people in 111 BC. Right after that, a whole lot of rich people in the South escaped, and they were the first wave of what we called the boat people. They got out of there. Canada accepted a number of them. A couple of years later, in 1978, there was a little skirmish, a border skirmish between China and North Vietnam that thankfully ended quickly. But the Vietnamese government decided to take it out on any South Vietnamese, or now Vietnamese people who were of Chinese ethnic origin, and Rebecca Trin's family was one of them. They had their property confiscated. Sam's husband ran a small business. Rebecca was an editor in a newspaper. They were fired from their jobs. All of their assets were taken. Their house was taken from them. And so they had to escape in order to save their lives, them and thousands of others. I won't tell you the entire horrific story of their escape, but I'll tell you one part of it. They were on a ship with about 325 other people trying to escape, and they were on their way to Indonesia because they had heard that there were refugee camps there. They were within sight of the Indonesian coast. This was after about 2 months of just horror, when a naval ship, an Indonesian naval ship, came alongside, threw a chain on the ship and towed it back out into international waters and said, "You're not welcome here. Go 2 weeks that way and you'll get to the Philippines. Maybe good luck to you over there." The captain knew that they would not survive that. There had been deaths on board already. 2 infant children had already died on board. They were short of water and food. The only way was to go north in the Indonesian coast, wait for a moonless night. He got within about 3,000 yards of the shore, and then he announced to the ship, "All right, grab the knapsack," because each person was only allowed to bring 1 knapsack worth of personal belongings, "and take from the ship anything that'll float, and good luck to you, swim to shore." And so here was Rebecca Trin and her 2 children. They are on the deck of the ship, which would be jumping from a 3rd-story window into the inky black water below. Sam jumped first. They heard him shout back up. Rebecca then put her foot on the little dress of a 2-year-old Helen, took the 6-year-old Judy, imagine a parent doing this, threw her into the darkness, hoping that she would land somewhere near her husband in the waters below. She heard the splash, and then she heard her husband yell back up, "I've got her. Throw Helen." Now, what do? He picks up the 2-year-old screaming child, throws her as far as she can into the air, dives down like off the 3-story, like I said, hits the water, scrambles back to the surface, hears a splash, reaches and catches her. It was a miracle. They swam to shore. It was about 2 months of refugee camp to refugee camp to refugee camp until finally the family found a Canadian social worker in one of the camps. And then she was soon in Calgary. That story is but one story of hundreds, in fact, thousands that could have been told, but I use her to tell the story. Now, we know about what we call the boat people, but you know what surprised me? It was just like when the draft dodgers came. The vast majority of people, according to poll after poll, did not want them, did not want them. But we welcomed them and we did well. And thank God we did. So what we learned from the Vietnam War, I think, is we learned that it talked to our soul, because we learned that we were going to be less American and more Canadian. Canadian patriotism that we enjoy now is a direct result. Historian after historian that said this, and I stole their point. The Canadianization of Canada came from the Vietnamization of the United States. It talked to our brawn, because the power to influence world events is dictated by the size of your military and the size of their economy. And Canadians were small. We were involved, but no matter how much we tried to influence the events, the Americans simply ignored us. It affected our wallets because we decided to, as I said before, trade profit for principle, trade some wealth for our sovereignty, swallow hard and forget ethics. Why? Because of jobs and profit. It also affected our hearts because we did welcome, not all, a minority, but we welcomed the draft dodgers in, running from an unethical war. We welcomed the boat people, again, a minority, but we did welcome them. And they did as all minority groups did, and they did very well. And Sam and Rebecca both started businesses of their own, and they did very well. Thank you very much. And they retired as not wealthy people, but certainly well off, and they were able to. They're now enjoying a healthy retirement after working hard and contributing Canada for years. I spoke with Judy, remember the first girl, the girl that got thrown over the side? And ever watch the National? If you watch the national TV, you will see every once in a while a reporter that looks Asian, and she will say, and this is Judy Trin in Ottawa for the National. That's the little girl that got thrown over the side of the boat. So that is what I had to tell you today about things that surprised me about the Vietnam War. The name of the book is The Devil's Trick: How Canada Fought the Vietnam War. And I hope that my skimming along the surface of this book inspires you to go and get the book, and you can get it from Different Drum. Different Drum is a great bookstore in Burlington. You can get it from Different Drum, or you can get it from Amazon or Chapters, or as Stuart McLean used to say, reasonable bookstores everywhere. I would happily answer any questions that you have.
All right. Thank you very much, John. We're going to open it up to questions. I'm sure there are many. And what we normally do is we have, if you have a question, raise your hand. Gary will keep an eye out and tell you when you're up. And please unmute yourself, ask John a question, and then go back on mute. Okay. So Gary, I'll leave it to you to chair.
John, just before we start on that, I wanted to let you know that my older sister's one of her boyfriends was one of those 160 that Canadians that went down and fought in the Vietnam War and died. I don't remember his name, but I just remember that happening back in the 60s. So I can certainly relate to what you're telling us. I think Ray had a question.
Yes, John. Firstly, let me explain a couple of things. Firstly, I was born and grew up in Carleton Place.
Ah,
And so when you mentioned Doug Carey, the only Carey I can remember ran the funeral home in Carleton Place.
no, that wasn't him.
So, now, he probably wasn't a Carleton Place native. Anyway,
No, he was born in Oakville. He grew up in Oakville and then settled in Carleton Place afterward.
well, throughout I joined the Canadian Navy in 1963. So what you have outlined, I'm very aware of, in the sense that, that was the period that I served. And many friends of mine, American friends that I met along the way, served in the what they called Westpac, which of course you're familiar with, I'm sure.
Mm.
And in fact, one of my close friends, old friends and colleagues, was a Vietnamese whose father worked for the Americans. And he wasn't a boat person, but he came to Canada shortly after 1975, when, of course, the Americans pulled out. Anyway, the question I had, I also know of people that I know a brother of a classmate of mine in the Navy. His brother was a Marine that was killed in Vietnam. And anyway, so the question I have, I was very interested in the people that you mentioned. A lot of the people I'd never heard of. I was aware of the International Commission. You didn't delve into the point at which, and I believe it was 1971, which Canada put together a peacekeeping mission to go to Vietnam. I'm not sure under what they were planning to do in that period of time, but quite a few. I think it was a 3 month mission, or excuse me, a 6 month mission to Vietnam. We even sent naval components to Vietnam. Did you run across anything about that?
Yeah, I did, and that was part of. It was done under the auspices of the International Control Commission, because Canada was there from 1954 with the International Control Commission, with hundreds of soldiers, about 350 soldiers and diplomats, and we were there right until 1975. Well, 1973 when the Americans left. And when the Americans left, they rejigged the International Control Commission, and we stayed until 1975. And so what you're talking about in 1971 was done under the auspices of that. Yeah, and it was interesting. They called it a peace, but there was no peace. There was no peace to oversee. There's no ceasefire. There was nothing. So the whole thing was a political move more than a military move, although military people were involved.
I'm really looking forward to buying your book, because you've introduced me to a lot of things I thought I didn't know about Vietnam War, and that I'm really interested in delving into.
Thank you so much. Well, you can check out my website, and it's just johnboyko.com. And after you finish reading it, I hope you email me and tell me what you think of it. Even if you didn't like it, let me know. Any other questions?
Okay. Yeah, Jim? You got to unmute, Jim. Jim McDowell, you have to unmute.
Okay, that it?
Good. Yes.
Okay, I have sort of two exposures to that period of time. And I remember that the draft dodgers were not popular up here. But I worked for an American company, and strange as it may seem, we had a draft dodger was transferred into my office, and he worked for the company in the US. And I think he possibly had to quit down there, but he made his way across the border somehow and was hired by the Canadian arm. And he worked under me for several years. He's quite a character. And I think there was an amnesty given down the road after the situation there quietened down. And he did go back to his, I think he was from South Carolina, but from the deep South anyway. And he went back eventually, but he just did not want to go to Vietnam. He didn't, but he was accepted by all his colleagues, and but around us, we knew that there was this disenchantment with draft dodgers that were coming up here to take jobs and that sort of thing. The other exposure I had, you mentioned the Chinese people who lived in Vietnam, and there was a family, well, they were boat people, Chinese. They lived in Vietnam, but as you say, they were unpopular there, so they had to get out, and they ended up in Winnipeg. But I'm very, very close family here. Their children are living in Burlington in the medical profession, and they really contributed to the welfare of the Canadian economy.
Mm. Yeah, you mentioned the amnesty that was finally given. It was Jimmy Carter, President Jimmy Carter, on his second day in office in 1977, that said that all draft dodgers can now come home, not deserters, people who had signed up and in uniform and then left. They couldn't come home, but the draft dodgers could. And I read some interesting accounts where a great number of news organizations went to some big border points, and they were going to interview the waves of thousands of Americans that were coming home, and they were sorely disappointed because almost all decided we'll stay. Thank you. We're not going home. Some did, but the vast majority stayed home. They had turned Canadian.
Sure.
Next question. I'm not seeing any more hands there. Ken, did you want to call it?
Sure.
Do you know what?
Thanks.
Let me end with one more story. I'll tell you this one story,
Sure.
and then I'll end it with this. And this is a story that's in the book. I skimmed along the surface, but this one story I really enjoyed, and that is that Lester Pearson, as Prime Minister in 1965, went down to Temple University to accept an award, a peace award, and he delivered a speech in which he complimented President Johnson on his handling of the Vietnam War, but at one point in the speech, he said, the bombing is wrong. You shouldn't bomb civilians. You will never win a war like that. When Pearson left the stage, there was a phone call waiting for him from the president, inviting him to lunch the next day at Camp David. So he went to Camp David, had lunch. Johnson ignored him throughout the lunch. He was screaming into the phone at McNamara, one of his cabinet ministers, and then took Pearson out onto this little balcony outside, and he started screaming at him. Screaming at Pearson. He got to Pearson for having criticized his Vietnam policies and the bombing of the North. He grabbed Pearson by the lapels of his jacket, lifted him off the ground, and said, "You pissed on my rug." Now, Justin Trudeau didn't get along well with Donald Trump, but I don't think there's any other example of an American president and a Canadian prime minister getting to that point. So that is the point that Canadian-American relations got to as a result of the Vietnam War. There's a number of other stories like that in the book, but I won't bore you with them now because, Ken, I know you want to close this.
Well, that's another reason why I always liked Lester Pearson.
There you go.
In my particular experience, and a number of the fellows here today have told you their personal experiences being Canadians during the war, like Ray being in the Navy. I guess I was naively living in a bubble when I was in university in the late 60s and 70s out in Alberta. And I always assumed, you hear about stuff in the news and so on, but I sort of felt that Canada was a really benign, neutral nation, and we were lucky not to be involved in that mess. And so it's a real eye opener to hear a lot of the things that you've presented today. It's really quite amazing. So thank you very much, and please feel free to take our thanks, and you can. And we're going to all run out and get your book this afternoon. So.
Thank you so much. I hope you do. And like I said to someone else, I hope that you email me and let me know what you think. So
For
thank you
sure.
very much for your invitation. It's been terrific to sort of
Yeah.
be with you
Yeah.
in this artificial way. Thank you
Great.
very much.
Thanks, John.
Bye-bye.
So for everyone, as you know, we have been recording this, and in a few days, we'll have it up on YouTube. And I'd like to mention that our next meeting in November 18, our speaker will be Ellen Besner, and she's going to be talking about the role of the Jewish Canadian servicemen and women in World War II. So stick around for our breakout sessions.